Hi, Mako. It's good to see you today.
It's great to see you as well.
You've been all over since the last time we shared. And I wonder if you want to talk about any of that first.
Yeah, it's been amazing since the last time we talked. We just came back from India, and it's Hejin's 10th year of making this trip. And little pause, 2 years of pause that we couldn't make that trip. And then it's my second year, and it was just incredible experience again, but even deeper, in many ways. So the, the incredible things are happening there, and in terms of culture and what is being built out and lives being transformed, and so I'm grateful for that. It was quite a journey, both going and coming back. We had cancellations of flight last minute, which, as you know, is stressful and taxing. But as we're all learning, these slowdowns are good. They help you to see and experience things better. So, excuse me. I felt like that was part of the plan, part of the trip. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and that's part of a bigger conversation. But today I was wondering if we could talk about ideas of beauty and utility.
Yeah.
We've heard so much talk. I mean, even today you shared that Edel Adnan response from White Cubes, and Brianna Kinsman of In-Break Residency just shared about the sacred space being constructed with beauty, power, and possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
what do you see as the relationship between beauty and utility?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I think purposefulness and utility is very important. And we don't want to dismiss in this conversation. I tend to speak against utilitarian pragmatism. Those two words combined create a new term, I suppose, that is not necessarily utility driven or even purpose driven. There's artists dealing with time and space that in some ways transcends utility, and in some ways opposes that. So, or if you were to measure the value of artworks and cultural outputs that was not recognized in that time as utilitarian value, you see how important these works that wasn't recognized as useful of the time. Emily Dickinson's poem, Vincent van Gogh's paintings. I mean, you go to, you look back in history and you realize how, in some ways, what was utilitarian value is no longer around, in many ways. So, but having said that, I don't want to dismiss utility, because that's all pragmatism, And when William James wrote that famous book on pragmatism, it was it was not about just industrial pragmatic. It was about psychology of human beings being very much needing a pragmatic way of existence. And so those are important, but when we become obsessed with value only in terms of utility, and how useful is it? So for instance, we say, well, let's use the arts to create a better society, or speak about peace, or whatever. And that's an example of what art, that actually limits the power of what art can bring.
Yeah. And so when there's talk about using the arts, how does that correlate with use of beauty? And how does beauty exist in our time, in our culture, without being taken over or captive to utility?
Yeah, so that indicates how our culture is driven by transaction, right? The value is driven by transactional realities. So usefulness is connected to, is it marketable? Is it something that I can gain power by using it for transaction? And that runs counter to many of art's fundamental essence of being. And it just happens to run counter to whatever it is that we value in terms of spiritual values, or what we might call culture care values. It doesn't necessarily, it's not like we need to be against transactional realities or the marketplace. But according to Lewis Hyde, HYDE, who wrote this seminal book called The Gift, he argues that gift economy exists, it needs to exist independent from the capitalistic market system, transactional market system. But it's not just because a gift economy is important. It's actually because for capitalistic society to work well, you have to have the gift economy operating within it. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I thought of modern economics and our market in terms of, well, it's all transactional, and it's dehumanizing because it's all about, who gets to sell their work the most and so forth. But I've been kind of rethinking this in light of, when I trace back to the roots of modern economics, and I've been reading Adam Smith and all these Scottish Enlightenment folks who began our journey toward what we know as capitalism and transactional utilitarian industrialization of the world. And I began to understand that at the heart of that argument for creating an industrial multiplication or capitalistic society, Adam Smith was assuming that this is part of our moral work. He wrote this book called Moral Sentiment before he wrote Wealth of Nations. And Wealth of Nations was kind of an appendix to this huge work on moral sentiments. And I realized, well, maybe we have it backwards. We talk about supply and demand and scarcity reality. So therefore, artists have to survive and they have to market their pieces to survive, blah, blah, blah. But what if the moral sentiments of beauty, for example, which is part of, according to Adam Smith, part of our longing for wholeness, right? And beauty is one of the ways, one of the signature for that. And so what we are dealing with is a reality in which society has discarded beauty as in a holistic term, only to make beauty transactional, right? And that creates a way in which we lose beauty itself. Because we have forgotten that beauty is connected to the moral values, moral sentiments. And when that happens, the gift economy of love and beauty is no longer, allowed to exist in a conversation, of CEOs talking about their bottom lines. But according to Adam Smith, when you do that, you lose everything. You lose capitalism, basically, because you no longer have factory workers showing up to work, loving their work. You no longer have care for people designing the products to care about beauty. And the whole thing kind of collapses on its own its own struggles. And so this is really interesting, and this is where art fundamentally, as one of the last harbingers of gift economy, artists do things purely because they love to make art, right? Becomes fundamentally the essence of modern economics. But how far we have gone off, from that reality.
Yeah. And so outside of transactional beauty, what are some of the ways that you have cultivated noticing beauty?
Wow. Yeah. That's the right question to ask, because in order to notice beauty, you have to get out of the transactional mode. And there it is. If you don't do that in regular basis, you might be very successful, in marketing yourself and creating so-called cosmetic beauty or beauty in some ways that's useful to society, but you lose your soul in doing that. The more successful you are, the more empty you feel. And that's certainly something that, when you journey in life, you experience, multiple times. You get pulled into certain projects that, tend to define success differently. But it doesn't ultimately help you to slow down and notice the very thing, very beauty that is in front of you, that is all around you. And to that extent that, the word for it is we are creating idols, like there's something to worship that is not true. And we end up worshiping ourselves because it's actually our own projection that we want to hold on to, that is not really ours to begin with.
Yeah. A friend was recently asking me about rest and how I rest. And the best answer that I could come up with was looking at nature. Right? And I think that so much of what we can learn about beauty also comes from nature.
Yeah.
And I wonder about the corollary between beauty and rest.
Yeah. You've been painting lilies, I noticed, and I hope everybody sees that, because I think that's, I think what I see there is this liturgy with nature, right? That you're kind of beginning weaving of what you observe and the rhythm of light and shadows, and because as Cezanne famously said, the apple is not the same, an hour later. So he's trying to capture that, transformation, and I love that. I think there's something to be observed about how artists tend to find ephemeral things permanent, right? Then you're capturing the flow of something that is deeply rooted in a longing for being part of something greater than ourselves. And and so your post reminded me of that. I forgot the question. Thinking about that.
What is the corollary between rest and beauty?
Oh yes, yeah, that's right. And that art fundamentally is Sabbath, right? Because it doesn't, you're not creating something useful, let's say, but you're resting, and without Sabbath in sound, you don't have music, right? You have to have silence, you have to have pauses. And same thing with visual art, same thing with poetry, same thing with theater, dance. But we don't talk about the value of Sabbath, in our work, and we tend to be frenzied by what is pressing upon us, and things that we have to capture and market and put it on Instagram, and those are actually things that wears away easily. And even digital imagery, I was thinking about this lady, but doesn't remain with you. You have to go to the next image, but something that's painted will stay with you, and that that reality, I think, is something that we will soon discover as time passes, with all the NFTs and all the digital imagery. What remains may not be what we think is flashy and has thousands of followers. And so I think artists have to think about that.
Yeah.
And it has to do with Sabbath, actually, going back to Sabbath. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that's also part of that pushback against the pragmatic utilitarianism, right? Like, it's so other to say, no, today we rest.
Yeah.
Today we rest in beauty.
Yeah.
We notice the light on the painting behind you shifting, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. It's a beautiful time of the day. Yeah.
It's in those transitory moments of the temporality, the fleetingness of it all, that a different beauty is revealed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I do feel like, when I'm here, and I when I get to see the light shift, right, and it's seasonal too, because this time of the year, February, we're starting to see the sun angles shift quite a bit. The crocuses are coming out, and so many sign of spring, and song sparrows are starting to sing their spring tunes, and that shift is fleeting. I can take a photo of that, but that doesn't really capture the whole the beauty of this moment. And there's something about that that's profoundly important to me now. Things that you can't capture, things that we can only allude to, and maybe our art can respect and honor that, what it called a silence, Sabbath, things that are maybe discarded, often put aside because we want to be utility minded.
Yeah. I think about how much, when I was working for you in New York City, you would emphasize, and now we're going to watch this dry. And in our society, it would say, you do the painting, like lay the pigment down, and then move on to putting the next pigment down, or go and respond to emails, or go to a meeting. What are you doing? That's wasting time watching paint dry.
Yeah.
And how important and integral that is to the actual work of the artist.
Yeah, and not many, interns would stick with it. You were one of the few, but those moments I remember. I mean, isn't that amazing? I mean, I don't, I remember like running around, and I remember all these meetings, we attended. I don't think I can name one, but I remember that moment when we watched, yeah, paintings dry, and that seems incredible to me. That's first of all, that's a treasure to be experienced, um, and I'm so glad that I kind of insisted on helping the rhythm of whatever we were trying to do accomplish, not dictate that moment, sacred moment, but it is amazing how our memories long for those wasteful moments.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And now so much of what I share is watching paint dry,
yeah,
like as the salt is changing it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
um and sometimes and it's sped up into a time lapse, right? So that it's
yeah, it's compressed.
satisfying in that way. But like you, I'm like, but we're missing something here, right?
Yeah,
So working to reclaim that in
yeah,
a different way. But maybe it's something that can only be experienced in person.
yeah, and we just had this conversation about it, but I do think there's some value in not recording it, as you noted, and letting the time pass, and dissipate, and not have any photos or videos to capture that. Maybe that's Sabbath in a sense. We're maybe we're letting our iPhones rest. Maybe that's important for many reasons.
So living into beauty as a way of experiencing Sabbath and rest.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much, Mako, for talking with me about this.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lydia. I
Very
appreciate
good.
it. Yeah.